It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Amy King. Hi, Amy. How are you?
Hey, Douglas. How's it going? It's so nice to talk to you again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming back on the show. As we were just mentioning, you were on the video show. How long ago was that? A few months? A couple of months ago?
Yeah, I'd say it was beginning of September. Yeah.
Okay. And we had such a lovely conversation. We had to cut it off because of the format of the video show. And so we invited you back to do an audio podcast where we don't have any particular limitations on time or content. And we can just sort of freestyle conversation. Yes. And we were talking about music and about arts and making a living.
Last time I had to, because I was on the show, because I was releasing Attack of the Black Rectangles, we talked about that. That had to be the focus. And then, but I wanted to ask you about being a songwriter, and I wanted to talk to you about just the arts and what it's like to live a life being an artist and things like that, because I'm doing that, and you've done that, and you're doing that. So I don't know. I just wanted to talk about it a bit because I find artists fascinating.
Well, we're definitely a unique breed of people, that's for sure. And we don't look at the world the way I would say a lot of the people in this world look at it. We look at it in a different light. We find humor in things that most people don't think are funny at all. And,
amen.
Yeah. But, also, as I remember, you are a teacher, correct, at a university? Professor?
I do teach. I teach as well, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so to suggest that we've both made a living from our art for our entire life wouldn't be accurate. I worked for 20 years at a financial investment firm in Boston. So I was like one of those Wall Street kind of guys for 20 years, which is diametrically opposed to being an artist.
But really clever. I mean, if you could pick because I'll tell you what, education, especially grad school, like where I teach, I mean, I actually had to take a leave because it doesn't pay enough for the time it takes. So it's whereas you went into something that made logical sense, it could make you money and teach you how to be smart with money, which is wonderful. All I did was sort of, stand at a lectern and say stuff I thought and then not get paid well. So no offense to them. No education is paid what it's worth. I don't think no educators really are. But yeah, we always do need the extra. You need the extra grinds. All right. Like my most of my money, comes from speech writing and public speaking.
Oh, okay. Well, now that's interesting because you would write speeches for someone else.
No, just for me.
Oh, so you write the speeches, you give the speeches, and you get paid.
Right.
And you get paid for that.
I get paid for because I write for young people as well. I mean, so I'll speak at other universities. I can speak, I can do that type of thing. I can speak at other sort of professional organizations, conferences. So looking at libraries, teachers, English teachers especially. I can do professional development at a high school level usually, and then I do assemblies. I'm the lady who comes in and gives you a few hours off class. And so I will go into schools and talk real with the kids, and just get them engaged in that arty kind of brain, right? To bring in that art brain and go, hey, this is the stuff I'm thinking about. This is the stuff from real world that connects to why I write books, right? So that's I can't say that's what makes most of it, but it certainly is. But if it wasn't for the art, right? If it wasn't for the books, I wouldn't have that opportunity. The same with the education, with teaching. So for me, it still always goes back to the fact that I'm an artist, right? That I write books. But whereas, like with your example, totally unrelated, I'm sure, but smart.
Well, it wasn't my idea. I'll tell you that. It was my mother's, and just to give you a quick bio background of me in case you don't know, when I was 18, I grew up in Boston, and when I was 18, I moved to New York City because I got accepted to go to the American Academy of Dramatic Art.
Nice.
And I knew from the time I was in high school that I was to be an artist. And I didn't really care because to me they were all the same. Acting was the same as music, is the same as writing, although I was less of a writer in terms of novels. I was writing songs. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it was all connected to me, and I didn't really care what I studied or what I was going to get involved in. I knew I just wanted to be involved in all of it, okay? This was long time before the internet and DIY, so there wasn't this opportunity to, you know, do your films or whatever on YouTube. I think there was no such thing. So I went to New York City, and while I was studying acting at the Academy, I hooked up with a band who was looking for, remember the days when you'd look in the newspaper for ads?
Yeah,
of people,
of course.
personals and things like that? Okay.
Sure.
So I found this one. They were looking for keyboard player, singer, songwriter, and I hooked up with them, and we hit it off. And they were fairly well established already in the local New York area. Okay, they had gigs lined up in the Village and some of the small clubs down there. They had an annual booking on the Long Island Music Festival. And so I thought, great, you know, because I could just join in sort of a more established band rather than starting with, you know, a garage band from zero. So we were already there. Fast forward, I was going to school at the same time I was trying to do the band. It just was too much. It wouldn't work because all day I'd be at school and then I'd have to do band at night, and I had no sleep, which, you know, when you're 19, you don't care. But after a while, it just sort of... So I quit school because I really, my passion was for music. And the band, we started to do well. We were getting interests from record labels and things, and it was right at that moment that I got a call that my father was ill and I needed to return back to Boston. So I did, and he subsequently passed away a few months later. And then everything shifted. Then with a great deal of persuasion from my mother, I got off that road, and I went and got to the university and got a degree in business, and then I went to work for 20 years.
Okay. But you were still, I'm assuming you were still making music and certainly writing songs during those 20 years, right?
Well, that's the funny bit, because I worked for 20 years doing that. I wrote 2 songs.
Oh,
Once I retired from that work, and this is sort of part 2 of my biography, is I decided to cash out and just get rid of everything. So I sold my house, I quit my job, I moved from Boston to Las Vegas, sold most of my furniture and put what I did have in a little storage, you store it, and stayed in Las Vegas for about a year or so, and then took off to Thailand and worked for 3 years in Thailand as an English teacher in the middle of the rural rice deltas, about 300 miles north of Bangkok. And in that 3 years, I wrote about 20 songs. So it was all built up inside. I just couldn't, I couldn't make that switch. Like after working all day with people's stock portfolios and things like that, and then come home, I couldn't just switch my brain to the other side and start writing. It just didn't work.
Absolutely. That's interesting, because for years, right? Okay, so I wrote my first, here's bio for me, right? So I wrote my first novel. I wrote my first 4 or 5 novels on typewriters. So it was, I won't say pre-computers, because technically we had computers way back, but you know what I mean, pre-normalized, home computers. Yeah. So I was in Dublin. I was living in Dublin, in Ireland, and I wrote, I guess, the first 4 when I was up in Dublin. And I was 24, and I'd gone to school for visual art, right? So my background was visual art. Photography was my degree, which is hilarious because, of course, I became obsolete, sort of late mid 90s, which is wonderful. I was a darkroom rat. My biggest thing was darkroom and that kind of stuff. And printing. I really loved printmaking, and that became silly, which was fine. I'd always wanted to write. I'm a big reader, So I started writing novels. Great, and I was in the wrong country to do this. I mean, there was only one literary agent at the time in Ireland, and he did not represent women. And
he didn't represent women?
Douglas. There was a poetry press in Dublin till I think maybe the early noughts who wouldn't publish women either. Oh yes,
Wow.
that's a thing. Anyway, we won't get into that. The point is, I was there and I was writing, and honestly, to be honest, the work wasn't good enough, and that's fine. I was finding my feet and just teaching myself how to write, and then it was one of those moments. Now, because I was in Ireland and because I was an American, right? Although now I'm a dual citizen, but regardless, they wouldn't allow me to work, the Department of Justice over there, because the unemployment situation was so dire. Unless what was it? I think the wording was, unless I could prove that I could do a job that an Irish person could not do, I couldn't, work. And I wasn't going to do that. So I started writing. Excellent, whatever. I had a first break in my life. Actually, I had the first time ever I just had a break. I'd been working since I was 14. That was weird. But then came the time where we bought the farm, bought a derelict farm down in Tipperary, and I realized, I could teach, yeah, sure, but I didn't want to because of the thing you just described, the amount of writers I knew who were teaching full time but didn't have that time, or the switch. The switch was impossible once you got home from work. Plus, you're tired, right? You're exhausted. It's a long day. Yeah. So I decided, we'd always wanted to be self-sufficient anyway. So the next 10 years then, and the next, I guess, 4 novels were written while I was a self-sufficient farmer. I kept my foot in. I did start teaching and training in literacy. I taught adults how to read and worked inside of the curriculum there and that kind of stuff, which was more, that's really, if you know me, I'm a lifelong volunteer, so it tends to work perfectly for me. But it meant that I could see it as volunteer work, see it as a very part-time job, and really just grow my own chickens, potatoes, carrots, anything I ate, I grew myself. And that was a decision because I wanted to keep writing. I was like, nope, this art is important. It'll maybe take me somewhere, right? So, and then part 2 is simply that, it took me 15 years to get published. So I wrote many novels over those years, and I got rejected hundreds and hundreds of times. And finally, somebody said yes once I moved back to the States. And here I am. But it was just sort of interesting to me that, because people ask, and I was like, look, we can joke and say starving artist, but starving artist really is a choice, right? That's a choice. And that was what I did. And it was totally, I had the privilege to choose that, and I did. And I think it paid off because I got to have those quiet days where I, watched birds and dug dirt and, did that kind of thing. So,
well, you need that because that's what gets you to the other side of the brain. I've heard that from authors, many authors. They said part of my process is sitting there staring out the window because you need to clear your brain from or switch your focus from the right side, the left side to the right side. And it doesn't, some people jog, some people exercise, whatever it is that gets you there. But for me, I needed a huge change because 20 years stuck in the same commuting every day, same office, same people, same work, blah, blah, blah. So I took off and went halfway around the world. But it brings me back to a question. Why did you go to Ireland? What was the connection there?
My ex-husband was from Ireland. So,
okay.
So it seemed right. And, it was that honestly, looking back, I couldn't have told you this on my way to Ireland. I'd been before, obviously, before I decided to move there, but I knew something there was going to show me something that I wasn't aware of. And within no time at all, and I was only 24, something like that, 24 or 5. And up until that point, even though I'd been working my ass off, I had never had health insurance, right? Because this was the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and there was no law to say that your employer had to offer it to you, nothing like this. So I was working at really low-paying jobs, even though I had a degree, and with no insurance. And, when you're 24, 25, whatever, I guess you think about how maybe something could happen. And of course, I did actually. I had a few things happen that I couldn't get care because at that time the HMOs had come in, and no one would look at you, and I didn't have the cash. So when I moved to Ireland, I think the biggest thing was just the relief. People talk often about universal health care and just, start complaining about it without even knowing it, right? They don't even understand. But the weight that lifted off my shoulders, I felt like I was taken care of. I say now it's the way that we here, as all the opportunities are there, and I don't want to put it down. I love America for a lot of reasons, but it's not humane in the way that, you could get a terminal illness and it could bankrupt your entire family for generations. And that's not humane. That's not how to treat humans,
No, I agree with you. I agree. And not to, pivot over to a discussion on universal health care, but I do agree that everybody should be taken care of to some degree. And if you want extras and frivels, then you can pay for that on your own.
Yep.
I'll give you an example. A friend of mine in Canada, where they have national health, he works, has a great job. He's working as I don't know, auto parts or something, but he's in the executive area of that particular job. And they add a supplement to his already provided government health.
Right. Yep.
The doctor actually, he got very sick one time with a fever, flu, something. The doctor actually came to his house. And I mean, people used to joke about that in the 1970s about, oh, your doctor's still making house calls. So even then it was starting to become a joke. And I thought, you're kidding. The doctor drove to your house, checked you, gave you your medicine. He didn't have to leave and get out of bed. I thought, wow, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is what it is, and that's, so I knew that Ireland would have sort of open arms generally, because it tended to. And then it's funny, because in my work when I was in the literacy center, everyone else had closed their borders kind of to refugees and different people coming in before I moved, so I guess early noughts again, and we were getting a lot of people coming in from a bunch of different spots all over Europe, and that's the one thing about Ireland. I still feel like, I don't know. I still feel like I could do work over there, because they are so connected to so much of the kind of volunteer heart that I still have. But of course, I still have to eat, right? Which brings me back to one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about art and stuff like this. Here you are, I go into high schools, right? Like I told you before, I go into high schools. And one of the things I offer is sort of like a little like perk on the menu, right? If you want a little snack, I'm coming in, I'm going to do your assemblies. I'll talk to your whole, classroom. That's absolutely, or your whole building, right? In the auditorium. But over lunch, or maybe, some other time, I will absolutely offer a 20 to 30 minute kind of Q&A. First I talk a little bit and then questions with all of your artists. And I'm like, and same as what you said, whether it be a writer, whether it be, usually we end up in the band room, and I usually connect with the band director. My late daughter was a musician. And so I connect with the band director, and I go from there and talk to that photography teacher, and talk to, the art teachers, and just try and send a message that you send everybody, including your writers. Anybody who wants to do art, we're going to talk about how you can make a living at it, because we've been told so many times in this world, well, the arts, you don't want to get into it. I mean, Vonnegut even had a joke about that, right? If you really want to piss your parents off, go into the arts, and right, I dig it, right? I really do. Like, I'm not the only person in my family who's in the arts. I know plenty of people, I know all artists, and I still, to this day, people look at me kind of sideways when I explain to them that I pay for my own insurance. I mean, there's people who are in their 60s and 70s who have never paid for their own insurance. It's just such a foreign thing, whereas I've not worked for anyone since I was 24. So, but the one thing I say to these young people is like that it's absolutely possible, because of the same, you can have spin-off jobs, right? You can do this over here part-time, and it's a hustle. It's always a hustle being an artist, right? Because you don't know if that next album's going to take off, or if that book is finally going to, I've been writing for this long. That first time we talked is the first time I've been sent on an actual media tour, and I've published a lot of books, but it's just sort of, I find it amazing that and then they connect, the arts connect, like suddenly, like you coming, being in Thailand, suddenly I'm like, I have to paint again. My mentor was a painter. I haven't painted properly in 20 years, and it's time for me to paint again. And I find that, I don't know, it's an interesting life, isn't it? Because you're following a different path. Like you said, you see the world differently. You're following a different path than what everybody else thinks, that has been so normalized that you do look like a weirdo. But at the same time, I find that artists have a calm, right? Have sort of a calm inside of them. I think because we're, I guess, we'll call it feeding the art monkey inside of us. I just made that up, but there you go.
Well, that sounds good. Well, to use your analogy, being an artist or trying to be an artist, there is no path. And that's the whole point. If you want to be a doctor, You go there, it's laid out for you. Okay, you go to college, and you go to medical school, then you do your residency, boom, you're a doctor. A lawyer, same thing. The path is paved, and there are street signs showing you the direction to go. But for an artist, it's like you're standing in the middle of the Gobi Desert. Okay, which way do I go now? There's no path, there's no road, there's nothing.
And it never changes.
And it never changes, it never has. The only thing that has changed, and this is one thing I do want to get into with you, because it's one of my favorite rants when I get on this show with people who have something to say about art, is the internet. The internet profoundly changed the landscape, all right? It's still the Gobi Desert, but it's like you can go in any direction you want and do something. Okay, there are, in other words, they've built little stands, little water stands along the way or whatever. So there's something out there now. Before it was nothing. The problem with that is that it's become a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's great because everybody can do it, but it's also because everybody can do it. And I think that this DIY, you can self-publish a book, you can make a little video and put it on YouTube, you can sing into a microphone and strum your guitar and put that up on Spotify, and hey, you're on the same platform as, the biggest artists on the planet. Okay? Mm-hmm. I think it's giving people this delusion that they actually have some talent. The gatekeeper has been shot and killed and buried. And that is a problem, because what happens is that the system, the machine, is so clogged with just this crap, to put it bluntly, that the good people have to struggle just twice as hard to get their stuff noticed. So it's opened this whole new challenge for people who are serious about what they're doing, who have been validified as having some talent by people in the business. The amount of work is still the same. I mean, even before the internet, you had to work your ass off just as well. But instead of posting on your social media saying, hey, there's a gig on Friday at this pub, you had to go around and tack up pieces of paper on telephone poles.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Like I remember most of my rejection letters, right, are on paper, so I have them still somewhere in my attic. I remember when we switched over. Here's a weird story that I'll just throw out there. Before, when I was querying publishers or agents, not publishers, when I was querying agents in America from Ireland, back then you had to send. Let's say they requested to see the manuscript, so you were going to send a whole manuscript, a full. And to do that, you had to have a self-addressed stamped envelope. And they didn't care whether you were in rural Thailand or in Indiana. Those were the rules. And so because I was self-sufficient and I was living off I was a chicken breeder for a long time. I bred fancy show chickens and all kinds of fun stuff for other people. Wow. Well, not for, So what I would do is if I was getting close to the end of a book and I knew I'd be querying, I would figure out how much money I'd need to get the photocopies, to get the American postage, which would be international postage back to me in Ireland, right, the Irish postage. So I do all the math. And then I would hatch as many chickens, which is funny because that whole don't count your chickens thing, right? I know, right? So, but I would hatch, I knew how many pullets I would need by a certain date. So I would be planning 21, so more like 25 weeks in advance to try and make sure I'd have that money in hand when it was time. And then I could do all that. So quite a difference between sending an email that says, hey, here's my pitch, and them saying, sure, send a full, and then just attaching it to an email and sending it. So it's so different now. And you're right, it's so easy now. So they're getting, that was one of the biggest things, say, in publisher and in the literary world, was that their queries increased by, I'd say easily fivefold, almost immediately once they opened that sort of email path, avenue up. But on top of it, what you talk about is true, like there is a quality issue. And then, you've got books out there. I won't get into names because that's not fair. And because people read them and whatever. But you've got fan fiction, right? Which is out there all the time. My kid, to this day, that's what he reads. He reads fan fiction. And he thinks I'm going to judge him for it. I don't care. But it's not the best literature. This isn't edited work, right? But I still think it's cool work. Whatever. You're being creative. It's wonderful. But then when that becomes the thing that the publisher picks up, or when you self-publish it and then a publisher picks it up and it becomes the biggest hit ever, that's always strange. You read that first page and you're like, wow, that person, doesn't have, doesn't have the chops here, but clearly told a good story. Now, mind you, so it's interesting. We're also looking at the people who are ingesting the art, right? I look at my son, he's 15. His 2 or 3 top artists right now are holograms. And I say this not to break your heart, Douglas, okay? But they are Japanese holograms.
Yeah, well, I've read those. I've read stories about that where there's somebody on Twitter who's a hologram that has like 40 million followers or something insane. Well, this brings up another issue, because not only has the market been saturated to the point where it's created this whole new challenge for artists, but it's also, I think, diminished the quality of what people will accept. And that's more heartbreaking to me
Me too.
when people are reading fan fiction versus reading Shakespeare.
Well, let's not put Shakespeare out there, because that'll turn, like when you look at kids, right?
Well, okay, I've read Shakespeare as a kid, but I mean, okay, I'm a weird kid.
Yeah, I was a weird kid too, and some of the fan fiction out there is great, and I what I like about fan fiction, and I mean, this is one of the things, I guess, because I work with kids, is that, or not kids, but young people, is that I love watching people be creative, and they have this sort of secret little outlet for it, and people read it and then rate it and say things about it, and they get feedback, but they're not getting feedback from people who are skilled, right? We'll say, right? But they are readers, so they're skilled readers and they're into the story. So it shows us in a way that, plot is still, kind of, I don't know, it's central. What happens is central, not necessarily how beautifully, you've written your sentences. But yeah, you're right. The competition out there is different now.
Let's take this idea and apply it to 2 different forms of creative art, film and music. Okay, film is representing this concept very well, in the fact that the big Hollywood studios are only interested in producing Marvel comic type tentpole sort of film that has very little script. It's all CGI, it's all flash and glam, it's all bells and whistles. Very little story, okay?
Yep.
All of the films that I've seen that are the good stories, the romantic comedies, the dramas, they've all gone indie, or most of them have, okay? Absolutely the same thing with music. The big major artists, with a couple of exceptions, and I won't name names either, but so much of it is... I just thought of what Gene Simmons calls it. And I'll throw it out for whatever. It doesn't mean to be sexist, but he calls it tits and karaoke. And basically, it's just a lot of dancers twerking. They can be men or women. It's not gender specific. I've seen as many men gyrating out there in their underwear, too. And with this sort of somebody playing music on an iPad that is 100% computer-generated music, there is not one real person making the noise that you're hearing, okay? And I mention this to people that have been on the show who are like 18, 19. I have some guests on that are young, and I always want their opinions because I sort of feel like the old man sitting on the bench, just bitching about how the world's changed so much. And they said, well, you don't really go for the music. You go for the show, for the dancing. The music is just sort of background. I said, oh, okay. All right. Well, I could accept that. But anyways, to my point that I'm laboring to get to here is that the real music, the quality stuff, the stuff that people have put their human fingerprint on, most of that is indie now. And it wouldn't be possible without the advent of the internet and DIY. So in that sense, the music hasn't gotten worse per se. It's just moved. The films have not gotten worse. They've just moved.
Right. Well, and we have streaming now. We have so many different things, I mean, and then one thing that you left out, this is a huge conversation once you bring up the internet, is and I missed this because I was in Ireland, and so when I was pretty much off the grid, right? So I had this big system and some Wharfdales, and like CDs, So I was playing CDs still. I didn't have electronic music till I moved back here, and it took me quite a while to actually catch up with that. But by the time I got back in the early noughts, the stealing of music, right? The constant free downloads, and now as a writer, that is how a lot of especially with young people, that's how a lot of people have read my books, free downloads, and they don't understand that first of all, they don't understand that on a hardcover book, I make $1, right? and whoever my publisher is makes 90%, right? So they don't understand that, I don't think. People think that all writers are the big name. There's only a few of us can actually afford to live, off of our writing. But I don't think that even enters the mind of the youth who have always known the internet to be there. So you have that weird angle too. So those songwriters who are, those artists who are those bands for years who were making money because the only way to get their stuff was to actually, buy the CD. I mean, when I was a kid, I put a vinyl on and I stuck my Sony tape recorder in front of a speaker and listened to it mono, on a cassette. But I mean, that's the closest we came to stealing music. And whereas now it's click, click, you're done. And so there's that angle too, where suddenly I was very humbled after my first few books when I started to see how many of my books were seeded on these download sites, and seeing the numbers of downloads, and though those are usually inflated to make things look great for, I don't know, the pirates, I'm not sure. But when I saw that, I realized, oh, well, lucky for me, I'm in this for the art, right? I'm lucky for me, I'm not going to be too hurt by this, and maybe, there was always the argument, well, they're going to go buy your books if they become a fan. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. What I know is that that's another, obstacle, because then suddenly, maybe 1/3 of your books that are being read are not actually being paid for. And people sometimes would argue, be like, well, the library isn't paying you. I'm like, that's correct, but the library bought the book. Like that's
well, this has always been my argument against streaming, because if somebody went out and bought my CD or bought my album, I got paid. Now, they could have played that CD 1,000 times, or they could have taken it from the store and chucked it in the bin right outside. It didn't make any difference. I still got paid. But what happens with streaming is that in order to get the same money from one CD or album sale, somebody is going to have to stream your song 100 times.
Wow.
Now,
is that the difference?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
difference.
As much as I loved certain songs in my life, did I ever play them 100 times? Nah. Maybe there's a handful of songs I've played 100 times. Mm-hmm. But the likelihood of anyone playing the song. So what you got to do is you've got to get a lot more people listening to your music, which
is funny because now there's more competition.
Because there's more competition, right? So this has always been my argument. However, I did have a guy on. His name is Ari Hershire, and he wrote a best-selling book called How to Make It in the New Music Business. Okay. And he was on the opposite side of this conversation, which is why I wanted him on the show. He said that now, thanks to streaming, there are over 7,000 music artists who are making a living from their music. And when he said a living, he said more than $50,000 a year, which you could technically live on in the United States, or if you lived in a third world country, you could live like a king. But that wasn't happening back in the 80s when I was there were 7,000. Nah, I could probably count on one hand who was making a living. Now, the rest of us were starving. But it brings up the whole thing, and let's kind of wrap this, because we're winding down a little bit. Let's circle it back to, you were talking to the kids and about people who want to pursue being an artist as a career. The first question that needs to be asked these days, I think, is, do you want to do this for a living, or do you want to do this just because it's your passion and it's what gets you out of bed in the morning? Mm-hmm. And then the second question really has to be, does this person have the talent necessary? And then the third question is, does this person have the personal investment necessarily? And I don't mean money. It does take some money, but I mean the personal commitment to it. The second two, question 2 and 3, haven't changed since day one.
That's right.
Okay. The first question has changed a little bit because of the internet, because there are ways that you can make money with your music or with your writing or with your film that doesn't necessarily make you feel all warm and fuzzy as an artist, because you're in old-fashioned terms, you sell out somewhat so you can get the money you need to do what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and I think the beautiful place to be is right in that Venn diagram, right in the middle. Yes, it's something I would like to make money with one day, right? So that's the one, like sort of like you have to have that in your mind, because I think because of the Gobi Desert, right? Because we're artists, we don't know if it's going to hit the first time. But then that's the number one thing I ask young people. I mean, just generally, like I just was at a play this weekend and I asked a bunch of young people, I'm like, do you love that? And they're like, yeah. I'm like if you did that every day, would you love that? They're like, oh my gosh, yeah. I'm like, even the frustrating parts. Remember last week? Remember Tech Week? Remember how you cried? Yeah. Would you love that? They'd be like, yeah. I'm like, great. Then you should consider this. Oh my gosh, no. My parents want me to be something practical here. I'm like, great, that's great. But just don't stop doing the thing that you really love doing. Like it's usually made from a dream. But yeah, I mean, now you have that selling out. I saw an interview one time with I guess all the Grateful Dead were there, and I can't remember who was interviewing them, but they asked, why didn't you guys ever sell out? Which I thought was pretty interesting. And Jerry, this must have been early '80s from the look of Jerry in my memory, but Jerry said, "Oh man, we just sold out, just nobody was buying." Which I found really interesting, considering it was the Grateful Dead who sold out. I mean, any show I've ever been was completely sold out. But that's kind of. I have people that are like, I think I'm going to self-publish. I'm like, excellent. Let me explain to you. Here are the basics. These are the types of books, and this is the type of publication schedule you want to keep fans. Like this is what's been proven, right? These are the types of books that sell this way. They sell well, and you have to release a book probably every 6 to 9 months. But man, you can absolutely, if you want to call that selling out, I don't think it is. But unless you were planning, like if you wanted to be James Joyce, I guess that is selling out. But at the same time, it feeds you. So, yeah, you're right. The question one is definitely we have a few more options. But the other two questions
field
are still more.
It's expanded somewhat, which brings me to my last point, and then we're going to kind of have to wind this down.
Yeah, I know.
The other, I suppose, side effect, if you will, of the internet is quality versus marketing, because what's happened is that there's so much stuff out there that absolutely marketing to get your head above the swamp water and get noticed has become equally, if not more important. And I have this debate because let's put it this way, I have seen some great stuff out there. I've listened to musicians, singers who would make the angels cry with their voice, and not a soul knows they exist because they don't even have social media. And they don't do anything. On the other hand, I've heard stuff that's like, but they've got 1 million followers. They've got the glossiest website in the world. Things are popping up. They're always on Instagram, posting little 30-second things, TikTok. Here's what I had for breakfast today. Here's my dog. Here's my cat. Here's my bathroom. And every facet of this person's life. And yet their music is sort of, but they've got all kinds of stuff. And that they're making a lot of money from monetization on YouTube. And I think even Facebook is paying people now.
All of them do now. Yeah, Instagram too.
Right. So, the question becomes, which way do you go? I mean, do you put the quality on hold and just go for the marketing for a while until you get famous? Then you can do what you like, assuming you had talent in the first place. Because your talent,
that's the thing.
Your talent may not be with the creative art. It may be marketing.
Right. I mean, look, TikTok has just sort of taken off for literary stuff recently too. And I'll tell you, yeah, absolutely. You have your people with the millions of followers, and the quality of the work, not great, perhaps. You also have some, I'm sure, that meet both, and that's great. I think in the end, this is what takes me back to the farms. This is a great place to wrap up, or a nice sort of walk out into the wilderness, which is when I was on that farm, I didn't have any money. I lived on $5,000, or pounds or euro, depending on what year it was, a year about, right? Basically, my electric bill. I didn't have any other real huge bills, which, lucky me. I wasn't getting published. So what really mattered was, man, that poem was amazing. Did you see that poem I wrote this morning? And then looking back at the poem going, damn, I wrote a poem. That was a killer poem. And then, it was a great chapter. And so because I got to learn exactly what I just described, let's say Tech Week, the days I'm crying going, oh my gosh, I can't figure out how this novel ends, to, oh my gosh, I wrote a chapter today that made me feel like, I don't know, the Shaka Khan of writers. I just felt fantastic. Then that's what, luckily, and because of the struggle too, 15 years of a struggle, that many rejection letters, you have to become kind of Teflon, I guess. I don't even know if that's the right word. You just have to be tough. And I think that I come back to this space now, I just received and accepted a major award 2 days ago. To this day, I'm still just Amy who's getting rejected, who's hoping the next book will find a young person and show them themselves. That's it. Like, it's always just sort of, what is your real goal? Because if your goal is to become a millionaire, take a step back, you know what I mean? And you might become one. You could be that lucky person, but it's just about as possible as the Powerball, right?
Exactly.
At that moment, right?
Yeah.
So we go back to this sort of Pollyanna, but real connection to, God, I love making art. And that's it. Yeah. I enjoy making art. I have days where I suck at making art. Some days I write a chapter and it feels like really flat newspaper copy. No offense to journalists. I was one once. But other days I'm like, I cannot believe I just figured this out, and that sentence is the best sentence I wrote all month. And it feels wonderful, right? And that's the point, right? Even if no one ever sees the sentence, even if I cut the sentence out of the book in 2 months' time, I still love that I'm cutting it and going, bye, sentence, you were so pretty. And that's about it. And so loving the art and the process, I think, is the point, because I've also watched people be million copy sellers, and only 5 years later, they are not selling books. So, you have that, right? The old one-hit wonder kind of a thing, like in music or whatever. Right. And it's sort of, I luckily was raised by, very pragmatic people. And the art, I guess, because of those years on the farm, that's what showed me that I just like making art. And if it means it sells, it sells. That's great. If it doesn't, whatever. I'm gonna just keep making art and keep throwing it against the wall. And I think that's what makes an artist. Because I see a lot of people in my business. They'll write those 2 or 3 novels. They'll get their 100 rejection letters, and they're like, I give up. And I'm like, okay. Right,
well, that's the best guarantee to never be successful, is if you give up.
Correct.
But on the other hand, you need that hard realism thrown in your face before you set out on this adventure in the desert. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you're doing that, God bless you, because that's something that many people need, and they're probably not getting it from their parents. Like we talked about, the parents will say, no, you don't want to do that. Go to school, get a business degree, go work on Wall Street. Go be a doctor. Do something like that. Artist. Yeah, do that in your spare time. My parents had no interest in that whatsoever. To them, it was no more substantial than, I want to go play golf for a living.
Right.
Right. Yeah, it's a great hobby.
I have one of those in my family too. It's funny.
Yeah, my mother was that, and so that's how I ended up on a different road. And who knows what would have happened, but. With that, Amy, we got to wrap this up. Thanks so much for coming on. This was a great conversation. Truly enjoyable.
Thanks for having me back. Yeah, sorry, I totally interrupted you just there, Douglas. Yeah, I was just going to say thank you for having me back. And I always love talking to artists about art. And I love that you see it the same way. I love that you see that film and television. And I think I said to you earlier, those parents who are like, no, son, you need to be a lawyer. Arts are silly. And then they turn around and turn on the television. I'm like, someone wrote that show. Someone directed that show. There are actors there who are acting in that show. That's art.
Yeah, but not their kid. That's the difference. It's not their kid.
Isn't it funny?
Yeah.
Right. And so, so often we put the arts down, and yet there isn't one of us who isn't like, oh, did you see this show? Or, oh, did you hear this new, song from wherever? And so we I don't know. I'm always into talking to someone who elevates the arts, and I really appreciate that you do that. So
it's the same as, saying, oh, I want to be a sheep farmer. And they said, oh, that's ridiculous. And then they sit down to lamb chops. So it's the same analogy, really. Give out your website, please.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm where am I? I'm as-king.com. But if you Google AS King, you'll find me.
Okay. Yeah. Always a pleasure, Amy. Thank you again. Great conversation. Best of luck with everything.
Thank you.